Please, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Aidan Hollis, Professor of Economics at the University of Calgary, and the Vice President and Director of Incentives for Global Health, and also Professor Thomas Fogge, who is the Leiter Professor of Philosophy and International Affairs here at Yale University and the President of the Academic Stand Against Poverty. So, please join me in welcoming the two first speakers of the day.
Good, thanks very much, Alex. And we have basically 3 sessions on the Health Impact Fund. So there's a lot of time to discuss it. And what we'll do is in the first session just briefly recapitulate the proposal, the Health Impact Fund proposal, and the mini-HIF proposal, which is supposed to pilot the basics of the Health Impact Fund idea. We will have an opportunity for Q&A, but focus mainly on understanding issues, not on the deeper critiques and so forth, which we'll then begin to initiate in the second session, where we'll have 2 panelists who will talk a little bit about, sort of critically about what we are doing and constructively prepare the grounds for discussion. And then we have a third session where we can, with the help of the audience, discuss it more in depth. So that's the rough thing, and this will take us to somewhere around 1500 hours, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, after which we'll then go on to a completely new topic. Okay, so Aidan and I have divided the labor in such a way that I'll talk about the Health Impact Fund idea, which is what we envisage for the long term, and then Aidan will talk about the mini-HIF, which is the pilot of the Health Impact Fund. So background, at present, pharmaceutical innovation is incentivized and rewarded by product patents. So the only way you make money if you have a new medicine is you patent it in many jurisdictions, and then protected by the patent, protected from competition, you charge a very high price. And by high price, I don't mean sort of 20% extra or 25% extra. I mean often 100-fold or 1,000-fold, right? Hepatitis C just came out with a new medicine. That medicine is selling for $1,000 a pill. So that's a very, very, very large markup over the probably less than $1 that it costs to make these pills at the margins if you mass produce them. So these patents have been uniform since the TRIPS agreement, which is Annex 1C of the World Trade Organization Treaty, adopted in 1995. So developing countries came under TRIPS on the 1st of January 2005, with the exception of the least developed countries. Every country that wants to be a member of the WTO, and that means every country essentially, has to have these 20-year product patents. A product patent is a patent where the molecule itself is protected, so as opposed to process patents that India, for example, had before TRIPS. Process patents protect the way of making a medicine. If you're clever and find an alternative way of making the same medicine, you can, without violation of the patent, make it and sell it cheaply, which is what Indian generic companies did, to the annoyance of innovators. And with the product patent, that door is closed. And so you can't do this anymore. Now, the good thing about this regime is it creates a vigorous R&D competition, and the drawbacks are the ones that I now proceed to outline. The first drawback, of course, is that during the time that medicines are under patent, it's difficult for poor people to get a hold of that medicine, because the medicine is priced at a very high price, as I said, and so poor people have to wait until patents expire to get access. Why are prices for these new medicines very high? Interestingly, that has a lot to do with the global income distribution and also the distribution within countries. So we've all heard now, thanks to Piketty, that inequality has been rising. There's a lot of inequality in the world. I knew this before. Probably you did too, but many people apparently didn't. This is just the global income distribution to give you a sense. The blue area is the top quarter. The green is the next quarter. The yellow-green is the third quarter and the red is the fourth quarter. So there is a lot of income inequality. And what that means is that the more inequality there is, the more of a steep demand curve there is. So the red curve reflects how much demand there is for medicine at different prices. And if there are a bunch of very rich people who will continue to buy a medicine, even if its price is very high, then the price will be set at a very high level. So for innovators to make a profit that is the difference between their cost and the price at which they sell, multiplied by the sales volume. And so if they sell at 40, this is their profit. If they sell at 30, they sell more units, but at a lower profit, and so on. And so with this shape of the demand curve, you'll sell at a very, very high price. I mean, not at 100, but even higher than 100, because you actually make more money selling to a very small segment of the market at a very high price than you would make by lowering your price to get more people involved. Aidan has actually got a very interesting paper on that, showing that even if firms could price differentiate and sell at different prices in different countries without parallel import problems, even then the optimal price within a country would exclude 80-85% of the population of that country. So intra-country inequality matters, and of course global inequality also matters because of the parallel import problem, that if you sell very cheaply in one country, drugs can be imported into another country illicitly. So that's one problem. Another problem with the present system is that it focuses innovation on the diseases of the rich and away from the diseases that affect primarily poor people. So if you've got a big population of poor people who have a certain disease, very few rich people have it, why should you do a big R&D effort with regard to that disease? Because you get a Hobson's choice as your reward. Either you sell it with the usual markup of a few 10,000%, in which case, sorry, nobody's going to buy your drug, or you sell it at a price that the patients can actually afford, in which case you have a very small markup relative to the markup that you get in your other products. The third thing, and that's actually a nice problem to have from our point of view, is that the present system is also quite wasteful. There are a lot of problems about lobbying and gaming the system, problems of patenting. You have to patent the medicine that you invent in all these different jurisdictions, which is quite expensive. You have to constantly be involved in litigation or almost litigation and altercations with others, because intellectual property rights are so extremely important. So an enormous amount of money is wasted on that. That's good for lawyers, but for no one else. There's a lot of wasteful marketing. Again, think of the United States as the prime example. Suppose you have two products that have functionally more or less do the same thing, cure the same disease, address the same problem. Now, given the enormous markup, market share matters, right? If I can win an extra 1% market share, that's worth a lot of money. But of course, my competitor is thinking the same thing and is also trying to nibble away my market share. And so I'm going to spend millions of dollars in advertising trying to win doctors and patients over to my drug. And the other guy is going to do the same thing. And so there's this enormous waste that's good for the advertising industry, but good for no one else. It also has the side effect of many people getting the product that isn't best for them, because advertising diverts them from the best product. So the Health Impact Fund is a way in which these problems can be addressed. It's a complement to the present system. And what it does, basically, it says to innovators, here's a second way in which you can also get rewarded. You can voluntarily register a new product that you develop. And if you do, it will participate in 10 consecutive annual reward pools, where a pool of money is made available to be distributed among registered innovators in proportion to the health impact of their innovation. It's voluntary, that's an important part. We don't need to change the TRIPS agreement at all. We are sort of, if you like, undermining the TRIPS agreement to some extent by saying, here is another way. You know, you don't have to go onto that track of getting a patent or getting many patents in many countries and being rewarded by marking up your price of your product to the wazoo. There's another way in which you can make money. Come to us, get on the Health Impact Fund track, sell your product at the lowest feasible cost of production, and get rewarded on the basis of the health impact for your good innovative work. We think the Health Impact Fund could work with a minimum around $6 billion annually. To put that in perspective, that's 0.007% of the sum of all gross domestic products. So it's not a huge amount. It's even small actually compared to what the world now spends on medicines, which is about $1 trillion. So $1,000 billion. And of course it could be enlarged. If this works really well, then governments and other funders could put more money in and thereby divert more and more products away from the patent track onto the Health Impact Fund track. And that is of course what we hope for. Now, the way it works is innovators can keep their intellectual property rights, but they have to promise to sell their product at this lowest feasible average cost of manufacture and distribution. And they also have to promise or contractually guarantee that they will grant cost-free licenses at the end of the reward period, so that generic companies can then get in the act and can, in competition with each other, produce the product and continue to sell it at very low prices. Now, what does it mean, the lowest feasible average cost of manufacture? How do we determine that? Do we just ask the pharma companies what is the lowest feasible cost and take their word for it? Well, no, we're going to check up on that. And in particular, one method in which we can establish the lowest feasible price is by asking the registrant to put the production of the medicine out for tender. And that's actually something that many pharma companies already do. So they don't produce in high-cost countries where they are headquartered, but they often find themselves an Indian company that is very good at manufacturing a drug and look for a reliable manufacturer in India and see who offers the best price. So we ask them to do that. We ask them to put this out for tender, go with the lowest one or two manufacturers, purchase the product from them, and then sell it to wholesalers at exactly that same price. So that way we can be sure that we get a good price, and in fact we would probably do better than companies do now, in that you could have a very much larger production. The expectation would be that everybody can actually afford to buy it, not just the rich. So the numbers, the production numbers would be larger, and companies could deliver the stuff, Indian manufacturers could deliver the stuff at a lower price, given that the unit numbers would be so much higher. We have a pretty impressive advisory board of people who work with us on the Health Impact Fund, and who like the idea and think it's worth exploring and worth developing. And let's quickly run through the way in which the Health Impact Fund addresses the three problems that I mentioned at the beginning. The problem of high prices is mitigated simply because we require all these products to be available at cost from day one. So a new medicine comes onto the market, and from day one, it's sold at that very low price that the cheapest manufacturers can produce it for, and can then be sold through NGOs, government agencies, and so on at that price. They could all buy it cheap, they could all pass it on to patients, and that would obviously contribute greatly to health equity, i.e. reducing the discrepancy between the healthcare that rich people get and the healthcare that poor people get, and would be a very big step towards affording universal health coverage. Secondly, the problem of neglected diseases would be mitigated, because if there is a disease that affects mainly poor people, it can now be a lucrative target for pharmaceutical research, right? You don't have to face that Hobson's choice that I spoke about, but you can register with the Health Impact Fund and make a lot of money by achieving a lot of health impact. And here, research firms in the developing world are at peak competitiveness, right? They don't have to, if you are a fledgling research company, a smaller firm, a public-private partnership or something, if you focus your efforts on cancer, you will have to compete with the big pharma guys who have researched cancer for a long time, spend oodles of money on it, have developed huge molecule libraries and so forth. But with these neglected diseases, hence the name, you can start with not exactly a head start, but you start on an even keel with the big pharma companies who haven't paid a lot of attention as yet to the neglected diseases of the poor. And thirdly, the Health Impact Fund would boost cost effectiveness. It would presumably produce vastly more health impact per dollar invested than the traditional system, because the traditional system, a lot of the money doesn't go into either R&D or the manufacture of medicines. It goes into patenting the product in many different jurisdictions. And patenting is not enough. You have to police your patents. You have to be ready to litigate. You have to check out, is anybody copying my molecule, and so forth. So that costs a lot of money. You have to spend money on marketing, or they do spend a lot of money on marketing. A lot of waste comes from counterfeiting, which also leads to the buildup of resistance to drugs, where people, if a medicine that's important to people is selling at $50 a pill or $1,000 a pill, it doesn't take long for clever people to appear who say, look, I can sell you a lookalike or a fake thing that is actually cheaper. And very often these drugs are total fakes, or they are diluted. You take one real thing, one real drug, and dilute the active ingredient 20-fold or something, with the result that people feel a little better, but of course the resistance to the drug is built up. So counterfeit drugs are, again, a very detrimental thing in poor countries in particular. There's a lot of gaming where people divert resources to trying to take shortcuts around the system, or to lobbying. Companies are spending a lot of time lobbying for better rules and so forth. And then there are vast deadweight losses that come about because many mutually advantageous sales, where a pharma company would sell above its cost but below the optimal monopoly price, many of these sales do not actually come about. And so the patient doesn't get the drug, the pharma company doesn't register the sale, but it would be in principle a profitable sale. So let's say the pharma company produces at $1 and sells at $1,000, then it would love to sell a few drugs at $200, still a lot more than the $1 that it pays for producing. But it can't sell at $200 without undercutting its own optimal price of $1,000, because if it sells to some people at $300, those who now pay $1,000 would find ways to also pay only $200, and the company would undercut its own, by assumption, optimal price. So there are three more bonuses of the Health Impact Fund, which I'll quickly run through, and that will be the end of my part of the presentation. The first is that the Health Impact Fund would foster preparedness against epidemics. This is on our minds now with Ebola, which was a recent epidemic in the developing world. There would be strong incentives to anticipate such epidemics, as we already do with regard to epidemics threatening poor people, and to prepare for them, because you would get money for achieving health impact. So if you know that Ebola is likely to break out and that there are going to be people affected, the possibility of an epidemic, you'll get yourself ready to do something to nip such an epidemic in the bud and thereby achieve health impact, just as we would if we knew that there are lots of rich people threatened by nuclear. You gear yourself up to help those rich people avoid the epidemic because you get paid for that. The second thing is the health impact fund can be engineered to forestall drug resistance. Drug resistance is a problem that the present system supports in some way, because the present system, the only way innovators make money is by selling at high prices in the first few years that the medicine is on the market until the patent expires. So I want to concentrate, I want to have a lot of sales early on, and the later sales is not going to be very profitable to me anymore. So I will want to sell my drug to everybody and their auntie, and that means often also to patients who are not very suitable targets for the drug, but that is precisely what leads to drug resistance. The more people take my drug, the more people are likely not to take it properly, forget it, to take it, don't take the full course, and so on. And that is precisely what leads to drug resistance. What we could do with the Health Impact Fund is reward the company not only for the health impact that they achieve, but also for preserving the efficacy of the medicine for the entire 10-year period. So we could pay them a good premium at the end if the medicine is still actually working well. And that means the company would then balance the two rewards against each other, try to optimize by maximizing the sum of the two rewards. And it would often say, look, it's not worth it to sell these additional drugs to people who can't really benefit a lot. This has very little health impact, and it increases the likelihood that we will not get a large premium at the end for having preserved the efficacy of the drug. So in other words, the incentives could be fine-tuned in such a way that the company itself has incentives to take the danger of drug resistance into account. The third and final bonus is that the Health Impact Fund alleviates last mile problems in drug delivery. So how much health impact a drug achieves is a function of two things. One is how good is this drug, how much does it benefit the average patient, and the other thing is how well diffused is the drug, how many patients does it reach, and does it reach the right patients, those patients who can really benefit. And does it reach the patients in good condition, and so on. All these things are things that drug companies currently don't pay all that much attention to, because the drug company makes its profit at the moment the drug crosses the counter. At that moment, the money comes into the cash register, and then it gets passed back to the drug company. Whether then the drug is ever used or is kept in your bathroom cabinet or fed to your dog or flushed down the toilet doesn't make a difference to the profit from pharma companies. On the Health Impact Fund system, that would make a huge difference, because you get paid for actual health impact, and that gets measured through statistical sampling. We look at how the drug is actually taken and so on. And that means drug companies will pay much more attention, will be incentivized to pay much more attention to what happens to drugs after the point of sale. In particular, they will be concerned that the drugs be fresh, be well transported, cold chain, uninterrupted, and so on, will be well stored, that the drug will be targeted specifically to those patients who can benefit the most, that the drug will be affordable. The company will often want to sell the drug even below the cost of manufacture if the extra health impact rewards that it gets by selling to very poor people outweighs the subsidy that it puts into the price. The company will be interested in instructing doctors and nurses to prescribe the drug carefully and to instruct patients carefully, because only if patients take the drugs the right way will its full health impact be realized. And digital with patients, they will want to promote proper compliance and adherence to the drug regimen, because again, that will magnify and maximize the health impact that the drug achieves. So that's my part, and now we go to Ada. So maybe I take a few questions on the Health Impact Fund and then we go through it. Just questions immediately on this presentation, and not sort of the deep objections which we get to later, but we get.
I might have missed it, but I'm wondering about how the impact is measured and what kinds of research have you put into the development of systems, technology to measure the distribution gain, especially in the countries.
Yeah, you certainly didn't miss it, so I didn't talk more about it. So basically what we want to do is devote about 10% of the total money that goes into the Health Impact Fund to measurement. And one way in which that could be done is we could charge that to the innovators who register as a registration fee, which would have the advantage that medicines that achieve very little health impact would pay as much. And so you would deter companies from registering drugs in which they have little confidence. Anyway, this would be a significant amount of money. And of course, it would ultimately come out of the pool directly or indirectly, because companies would say, I will only demand a higher price, basically higher reward, because they also have to pay for these measurements. So with $6 billion, that would be $600 million a year. This would be much larger than all the money that's now being spent on research and the impact. And we think that this is not just money spent on figuring out how much reward each of these innovators deserves, but it's also research that will help in general in doing a better job in addressing developing country needs. We just know far too little currently about what ails people in the developing world, how various medicines work, and so forth. So this would be very important information, not just for us, but also for organizations such as the Global Fund and so forth, to help them do a better job, NGOs and so forth. Now, how would we do it? Obviously, we could not possibly trace every single drug that is taken all over the developing world. We have to use statistical sampling. Now, statistics is extremely powerful, and you get a glimpse of that from the familiar case of exit polls in elections, right? You ask 2,000 people how they voted in the United States, and whoops, you know how the election went, with a knowable margin of error of plus or minus 0.8% or something like that. That's pretty impressive. Now, the key to that is, of course, random. You have to pick people randomly. If you ask only people in rural Ohio, you will find that the Republicans won the election, but you will not know whether it's really true or not. So, but with statistical sampling, that's what we have to do. We have to sample in different countries, trace up, find, we could sample by geographical area, we could pick a few little neighborhoods or something like that, and research in depth how a particular drug was used in that area. Or we could embed chips in a statistical sample of the packages, trace them up with GPS, find where these packages ended up, mix them in, and do it that way. So there are different ways of doing it, but we could, I think, get pretty good results, even with pretty limited means.
Just follow up. I see the use for epidemiology in that, is like a following the impact of the drug and its potential impact, but then we also have to take into account the volume of the drug sold, like distributed. I feel like both of those are important pieces of it, right?
Yeah, so what this statistical sampling would tell us is the average impact per patient, right? And then you multiply that with the number of patients, with the number of packages sold or something like that. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm interested in determining the fair price for drugs. Mm-hmm. So, as I got it from the presentation, you only refer to how much manufacturing is.
Yes.
But it's also, if I was the owner of the pharma firm, it's also investing into the research. So is that also reflected in the price for the drug?
No, it's not. So the reward for your research, for your R&D, that reward does not come through the price. So that's exactly how the two tracks differ. On the present system, the patent track, the R&D costs and some profit is built into the price. On the health impact fund track, that reward comes to you as a health impact reward. So that's the reward that you get annually out of that $6 billion pool, right? And here what happens is that this is why this is such a nice, efficient system. It is innovators will, under the present system, often harvest enormous windfalls. So if you invent Lipitor or you invent Viagra or something like that, you make $10 billion a year for a research effort that costs you maybe $200–300 million. And every year, until the patent expires, you make this enormous amount of money. Now with the health impact fund system, there's a competition, right? If there is a windfall, if pharmaceutical companies make a lot of money out of these $6 billion pools, then pharma companies will say, oh, this is a very attractive thing. I want to register another drug. I want to do another research effort for some neglected disease or whatever, and then enter the health impact fund system and harvest some of these rewards. And by additional people registering drugs, the reward per drug or per unit of health impact will be diminished to the point where pharmaceutical companies say, this is a decent reward, but it's not a windfall. So in other words, the reward rate per unit of health impact will equilibrate to the point where it is attractive for innovators, because if it ever falls below that, registrations will dry up and the health impact fund will not attract, so the reward rate will recover. And conversely, if the reward rate goes high and there are windfalls, additional registrations will occur and the reward rate will be reduced. So that's the way we reward the innovative effort, in a way that reassures both innovators and funders that there will be a fair price.
Right.
Nick?
Would contributions to the fund be tax deductible?
Yeah, so how do we fund the thing, right? We first thought that governments fund the thing, and that might be, to jumpstart the thing, probably that's what has to happen. But what we then think, ultimately, because we need long-term funding to assure innovators that if they start a research effort now and finish it in 2022, let's say, that there will be money to reward them between 2022 and 2032. So we need long-term visibility, and the best way to achieve that as a permanent fixture, so to speak, is for the Health Impact Fund to have an endowment. So if we had a $120 billion endowment, then we would have a big cushion, so innovators wouldn't worry that next year's $6 billion isn't going to be there. And we would also have a way, like Yale University, right? We would have a way of funding, of having an annual stream of dividends and interest payments and capital gains and so forth. And so the other thing that's great about an endowment is anybody can pop something in, right? I could say in my will, I can say, I want 30% of my inheritance to go to the Health Impact Fund. And of course it would then be tax deductible. There would be organizations, friends of the Health Impact Fund in all the different countries, and you could give money to them and they would then pipe it into the Health Impact Fund. Kira?
If I register the development of 4 different pharmaceutical products and 3 of them fail in the research, so they have 0 health impact, but 1 is relatively successful, would that be enough for me to sustain my company, or because from what I understand from the system is that because one product may be so extremely profitable, I'm also able to sustain research in products that is not profitable.
Yeah, so again, the mechanism that I just described, the self-adjusting mechanism, is going to take care of that, right? So let's say that the average rate at which these projects are successful, let's say it's a quarter, exactly as you stipulate, right? So 3 out of 4 research projects fail somewhere along the line. They cost money, but they never pay a penny. So now, in order for the industry to sustainably work with the Health Impact Fund, to continue for the Health Impact Fund to continue to sustain the companies that work with it, that register products there, the reward rate must reflect that. It must pay not only for the successful efforts, but also for the unsuccessful efforts, which, by the way, tend to be cheaper because most drugs fail well before the expensive clinical trials or the last round of the clinic. But anyway, that's right. And so if the reward rate is too low for that, then these companies will no longer, registrations will dry up. Either the company that you described will go bankrupt, or companies like that will go bankrupt and simply no longer register anything, or they will just say, we do something else. I mean, this is not paying us enough. And so the result of that is fewer registrations. The result of that is a higher reward rate per unit of health impact. And then the result of that is that it is now sufficient to sustain the research effort even with the failure rate. So I think the system is, in that sense, foolproof. It adjusts automatically and in both directions. So if the reward rate is too low, it will be driven up by market forces, and if the reward rate is too high, it will be driven down by market forces.
I was wondering, how do you link resistance, drug resistance, or if health impact directly to the companies? Because especially in developing countries, if a medicine works or not is dependent on many factors. First of all, access to healthcare, and if your doctor describes well what you have to do, literacy rate, maybe if I can read that to the package.
Mm.
If it's sticky and humid, maybe the pill doesn't work in the climate, or we have other diseases.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, how do you really link that back to
Yeah.
the company?
Yeah, that's good. And here, I mean, let me put it in my own terms. The problem is that there are many things happening in a country. So a new drug gets introduced, and we can then see, how many people take it, how those fare who take it. But then you come along and you say, but don't you know, Oxfam had a literacy campaign at the same time, or Oxfam had some hygiene campaign, or sanitation was improved, and so on. And so how do you really know how these different causal factors interacted with each other and so forth? So that's true, and that may be difficult to figure out. I mean, statisticians have ways of figuring that out. So for example, they can look at different locations in the country and see where Oxfam was very active, where Oxfam wasn't so active, and they can regress, right? And say, so we think that this is how much Oxfam contributed, this is how much the drug contributed, and so on. But for sure, this will not be precise. So there will be errors in the measurement of health impact. But here comes another nice fact, and that is that imprecision isn't so terrible in this case, for the simple reason that the incentives are pretty undisturbed. So take a very homely example, right? I have a huge garden. This is not a true story. I've got a huge garden with lots of apple trees. I want the apples harvested, and so I tell the local kids, come here and harvest my apples for me, and I'll pay you $1 per kilo of apples that you harvest. Now the problem is that my scale is very, very bad. It goes plus 20, minus 20%. It's a really lousy scale. And the kids know that, everybody knows that, and what do the kids do? Well, they do the same thing they would do even if the scale were precise to the gram, because sometimes they'll get paid extra, sometimes they'll get paid a little less. But on the whole, the best thing they can do to make money is to deliver as many apples as possible. And the same is true with pharmaceutical companies. So long as they can't game the system, their best interest is to produce as much health impact as possible. Of course, if they knew certain things, for example, that we will do our statistical sampling, this year we are focusing on that corner of Nigeria, that's where we are going to do our sampling. Then, of course, they'll throw a lot of effort into achieving health impact in that corner. So that we have to avoid. But if it's just random error that is not predictable from the part of the innovators, it's not going to make a real difference to the incentives.
So just that's be one last question for the moment. We're gonna go to the next presentation. It's my own brother, but
Get it in.
so I'll allow him this one question.
I was just curious that you said the HIF would cost $6 billion. How did we come up with this number?
Yeah.
How did we end up saying 6 and not 9 or 4.5?
Very good question. The 6 billion is a minimum. It's not, I mean, the sky's the limit, right? What we want to do is we want to run the Health Impact Fund, and we want everybody to have their mouths open in awe and say, why in the world didn't we do this earlier? This is so much more efficient, it is so much more just, and let's put more money in. Now we put more money in, then the reward rate pops up, but then people say, oh, the reward rate is now higher, and so more registrations come in. We want to lure every serious drug over to the Health Impact Fund, right? And only the baldness medicine is supposed to stay on the, sorry. I'm so sorry. Okay. Only, well, I didn't want to talk about that other medicine either. That should stay. So anyway, only those medicines, you know what I mean, are going to stay over there, and anything serious we want to lure over gradually. Now, why the 6 billion? There are two reasons for the 6 billion minimum. One is, you've already seen that, that's the measurement thing. The measurement costs money, as was observed in the very first question, and that is subject to economies of scale. So the measurement will get cheaper and cheaper the more drugs we have on the fund. If we have just 2 or 3 drugs on the fund, we are not going to be able to measure with just 10% of the money. So, and it just wouldn't fly politically if we had to say to people, look, 30% of this money is just going to be spent on measuring the health impact. That's too much, right? 10% is the politically acceptable minimum. With the fund at 6 billion, we get about 25 drugs on it, something in that order of magnitude, right? So 6 billion divided by 25 is $240 million a year, multiplied by 10 years that the medicine is going to sit on there. So they get $2.4 billion as a reward. That's good money, and for that, I think we get takers at that price. So of course, what the price will actually be depends on demand and supply, but that's our prediction, sort of roughly 25 drugs. And there the economies of scale are pretty good with regard to health impact measurement. And then the second thing is the volatility of the reward rate. So the best drug, right, when a new drug comes in, let's say a really good one, that could upset the reward rate. And people will anticipate that, and they'll be scared. They'll say, look, this is what the reward rate is now, but if after I register, suddenly somebody comes with some wonder drug for malaria, then the reward rate might just sort of go down to a third of what it is now. And this volatility will be the larger, the smaller the fund is. Right? If the fund is small and sustains only 3 drugs, a new entrant or a departure could, I mean, this could wag around like crazy, right? And so that will make these companies, they don't have enough uncertainty already. They don't need another big uncertainty. So if we have 25 drugs on average, something like that, in that order of magnitude, the reward rate is still going to, there are going to be these adjustments that I talked about, but they're going to be relatively small. From one year to the next, the reward rate will be pretty stable. It will, over the long run, it will rise, of course, because achieving health impact will become more and more expensive, but it will rise in sort of, gentle undulations. And that's the second reason why 6 billion is the minimum. Neither of these reasons speaks against 12 billion or 20 billion or whatever, but they all speak against smaller funding levels.
Right. Please.
So, it's a pleasure to speak here today. Thanks so much for coming. You might have been thinking, well, if this is such a great idea, why hasn't there been uptake? Thomas and I have been working at this for a while, and this is a pretty challenging proposal. And the first problem, of course, is that at $6 billion, we're talking $6 billion per year. We're talking real money. That's a pretty good chunk of the global health budget. And so, realistically, people have looked at it and said, well, okay, it's a nice idea, but, well, there's this measurement thing, that's kind of tricky, and where is the money going to come from? And also, where's the money going to come from? And then, quite a few more times, that last question. And, can I get other governments to commit? If I were willing to commit, would other governments? It's pretty tough. So I think, companies have been, I guess everyone is being suspicious that maybe this was not really a doable thing. Even though it sounded like a good idea, it seemed like it was just overly challenging to implement and to get started. And well, I think probably that's where we really were. And we knew that we had to run some kind of a pilot. And in fact, over the last couple of years, we've started a very small-scale measurement pilot on multi-drug-resistant tuberculosis patients in Mumbai. So that's happening, but there's really no significant money attached to it. Meanwhile, earlier this year, or maybe at the end of last year, some individuals in a large pharmaceutical company approached us and said, look, we're really unhappy with the system that we have today, and we've looked at all the different sort of proposals that are out there, and we think that there's something missing, and the Health Impact Fund looks to us like an approach that makes sense, because it relates value to what the company is receiving. And at the moment, there's a real problem with that, especially in developing countries. There's this kind of expectation that whatever a pharmaceutical company does is always seen as evil. But particularly when you get into developing countries, there's this expectation you have to sort of give your product away, and that's or something like that. And if you charge a higher price, something that's going to be kind of profitable for you, there's instant accusations that you're profiteering off the backs of the poor. And you can see how that's problematic for companies. Almost whatever you have a mandate to make money for shareholders. And you have this mandate to make sure that you provide product and this service to people who can't afford to pay very much, and sometimes really nothing at all. And so how do you join those two? Well, the Health Impact Fund seems to provide a nice kind of a way of actually making money by serving people in need who can pay high prices. So, but they also recognize that this the money issue was a pretty serious impediment to making progress. So they really challenged us to come up with something that was going to be manageable, within a kind of a scope that was something that was actually fundable. So that's what the mini-HIP is about. It's a proposal for you could call it a pilot, but it's bigger than a pilot, really. I mean, it's substantial money that is intended to test out some of the ideas behind the Health Impact Fund, to test out the whole measurement thing, to test out whether firms are willing to compete in a system in which there's a fixed pot, and they're competing on the basis of the health impact achieved. So those are things which we really needed to have tested to make the Health Impact Fund itself attractive. Okay, so I think it's helpful just to start off with the goals. So let's suppose you had a bunch of money, $100 million, and you wanted to spend it testing out, so to speak, piloting the Health Impact Fund. The first consideration is if you're going to spend that kind of money, you definitely want it to be a worthwhile investment. So you can't spend a lot of money just to sort of test things out for the health impact fund. It has to be something that's actually valuable in providing real help, because there's a real opportunity cost for money in this space. If you had $100 million, you better have some real benefits. So the first requirement is that it's got to generate meaningful, cost-effective improvement in health in populations in targeted countries. And the second thing is that you want to test the feasibility of rewarding firms based on health impact within a competitive mechanism. This isn't just about testing whether you can measure health impact. It's really about whether also you can do that in a way that's competitive. It also tests the willingness of firms to participate in a mechanism of that sort. Because that's one of the considerations and the challenges that people put forward consistently. They said, well, that our firm's going to look at this and feel that this is too risky and that they don't want to be there. Maybe they don't want to expose their products to being measured in this way. So we want to do that, and we want to provide information on the required reward rate for quality. So sorry, a little bit of language there. A quality is a quality adjusted life year. It's a standard measure of the impact of therapy. So if you look at all health technology assessments, it basically all uses qualities. There are different measuring tools, but that's the standard. And of course, you want to extend people's life and you want to improve the quality. So the quality adjustment is necessary, as well as actually thinking about the length of people's lives. Okay, so I've already mentioned this. Okay, I'll probably skip it. Okay, so here's an outline of what the mini-HIP would actually look like. So the idea is that incentives for global health, which is the organization which is working on promoting the health impact fund idea. It doesn't have to be IGH, but it could be another organization. Offers a fixed total reward, something like $75 million through an RFP, a request for proposals. Companies and PDPs, so this is product development partnerships, which are usually non-profit companies or a non-profit organization, which is organized typically around a specific disease area. For example, the TB Alliance works. It's a non-profit. It's funded in part by the Gates Foundation as well as various governments. TB Alliance works with companies to develop medicines for tuberculosis. So both firms and potentially also PDPs would submit proposals of how they could achieve additional health impact in low and middle income countries with a new product. In other words, they would basically submit a proposal about something they would do with a new product. Possibly, and it could be a variety of things. We'll talk about what exactly in a minute. So incentives for global health would set up an expert committee which would select several of those proposals. And each of the proponents would have 3 years to achieve health impact through its project. And the idea is that the starting dates for the projects would be in the reasonably near future, maybe within a year. You wouldn't necessarily require them to start immediately since there's usually some time to get organized. The key thing is that the reward would be split according to the health impact achieved. So you've got this fixed reward pool, you split it up according to the share of the total health impact achieved by each one of the individual projects. You could have interim payments made along the way, maybe one interim payment, since this is a very long period. And the kind of timeline that we'd be hoping for would be, to have the whole thing finished and wrapped up by 2021, 22, something like that. Okay, so what kind of projects are we thinking about here? A project might involve something like development and supply of an improved and context-suitable formulation. So often the formulations of products affect how usable they are. And there can be changes to formulation which really increase the uptake of a product. Just because it makes it, for example, could drive down costs, or it could simply make it more usable for a typical patient. Fixed dose combinations, pediatric formulations, new product, new distribution or treatment protocol, the addition of a diagnostic, which increases the effectiveness of a drug, or even a context-relevant clinical trial. And here I'm thinking particularly of the situation that in India currently, the government is requiring to an increasing extent that requiring companies to have an Indian clinical trial to demonstrate effectiveness of the product in India before it will license the product for sale in India. What you can see here is a set of very small kind of incremental improvements or projects that are going to push forward the acceptability and the usefulness of the product in particular countries. These are not massive projects. They're not bringing forward a new drug. In fact, you really can't hope to do that with the kind of money that we're looking at. We're looking at projects which would, on average, be rewarded with something like $25 million. It's not that much money. In fact, when we talked to companies about it, they said, and the reason we set up this amount, they said, you're just not going to get people out of bed for less than that. Right? So, for most of us here, I'm thinking $25 million is real money. But for these companies, they are expensive operations, and if you really want to get their attention, you want to get them committed to doing something, it has to be real money. And we'd be looking at projects which were geographically focused on low and middle income countries, and the project proponents would have the opportunity to say what it was that where they wanted to do their project. So essentially, these would be really flexible, not at all constrained in terms of a set of what was feasible and what could be considered to be a viable project. So the idea would be to get lots of submissions and then to work with proponents to make sure that we could identify several that would really actually work. And what we'd be looking for would be projects that would be expected to have a substantial impact on health, that would actually make a difference. That would be innovative in some sense. So it wouldn't be good enough just to say, well, I'm going to bring forward the same product that I already have with no changes, and I'm not going to do anything extra. It already works pretty well, and so I want to keep on using it. That really, that's not doing very much for you. You want to have projects where you could measure impact in a meaningful way. So it would, and you'd expect the proponents actually to bring forward suggestions on how to do that. And you absolutely have to have a meaningful program to ensure that there was going to be appropriate access to the therapy in the countries where it was needed. These are all a little bit vague, right? Because every project that you could think of is quite different. So here we aren't setting out a lot of stipulations about exactly what's required. And we're really looking for what would be, we're aiming to have the effect of competition open up possibilities for projects that would be really useful. So incentives for global health doesn't have the capability to measure the impact. So we've had discussions with the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, which does have the ability to be a credible counterparty in terms of measuring impact. By the way, I'm not quite so optimistic as Thomas is in terms of the ability to measure. It's actually pretty difficult, generally. Having said that, there's essentially, when you think about measurement, right now, who is it in the world that actually pays for most drugs? It's insurers. Insurers or payers? How do they decide how much they're going to pay for drugs and whether to put drugs onto their formularies? They look at how effective the drugs are in clinical trials. Okay, and this is basically what the Health Impact Fund would be forced to do. It would be, you could think of the Health Impact Fund properly as more or less an insurer with a different system. That's what it really is. It's an alternative payment mechanism which recognizes that we need to allocate the payments in such a way that we stimulate the investments that are most valuable in terms of improving health. And we need to make sure that people who are very poor are insured. This is a cooperative insurance mechanism across countries. That's what it really is. Okay, well, anyway, so, you know, the Health Impact Fund would face the same problems of measurement as insurers do currently. And those are challenging, but it's not like we're any worse off, actually. And, you know, if your initial response was to say, well, what we should do is we should never bother measuring, well then, you know, you might as well go and join Martin Shkreli at Turing Pharmaceuticals. You know, this is, like you have to measure, otherwise it's hopeless. So this is, I mean, it's a central problem, but it's not a unique problem. Okay, so we think in the RFP, the proponents should be asked to propose methods for assessing the health impact of the projects that they were proposing. And they would, of course, be given the opportunity to comment on the draft assessments that they had. And those assessments would really rely on existing clinical trial data. And to the extent you could, you'd want to complement it by data on compliance, access, volume, patient characteristics, because that matters a lot. The indications for which the product was actually used, those things. To the extent that you could get that kind of data, you definitely want to add it in. So in order to be meaningful, as I've suggested, we need to have rewards that are, on average, large enough. Remember that no one's getting a guarantee of anything here. So that's just kind of on average. It's possible that one firm can walk away with 80% of the total rewards. That's the idea, right? Reward value, and that's how you incentivize firms to actually provide value. So here the scale is set according to the requirement that we want to have, well, as a very minimum, we have to have 2 projects to have any kind of competition, but 3 would be better, I think. And so therefore you'd be looking at $75 million as a minimum